Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the last one. This next chapter will be leading up to the Revolutionary War, and hopefully, and then, the next one after that will be a bit more in depth on how the slaves were treated, how there were black people that were enlisted in either the British or the American colonist armies. So be prepared for that. Um, for those who are new, this is the People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. It's a wonderful book. I personally do enjoy it. As you can see here, I love the design of this front. I think they did a good job. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Mr. Zinn's work. I definitely recommend checking it out. He's quoted a lot in the history and political science department. And again, I forgot to do this, but I will be putting the bio of the author and the website to purchase the book in the description below for those who are interested in purchasing it, or at least maybe just reading the reviews or reading the description of the book. Just let you make a decision if you want to read along or maybe read after we're done. But other than that, let's go ahead and get back into chapter 4. Tyranny is tyranny. Around 1776, certain important people in the English colonies made a discovery that would prove enormously useful for the next 200 years. They found that by creating a nation, a symbol, a legal unity called the United States, they could take over land, profits, and political power from favorites of the British Empire. In the process, they could hold back a number of potential rebellions and create a consensus of popular support for the rule of a new, privileged leadership. When we look at the American Revolution this way, it was a work of genius, and the Founding Fathers deserve the award tribute they have received over the centuries. They created the most effective system of national control devised in modern times. It showed future generations of leaders the advantages of combining paternalism with command. Now, a small point to make. I don't know how many people are familiar with this or have maybe even talked about it with your friends when you're learning about the American Revolutionary War, but the American Revolution wasn't actually a revolution. For those who don't know, a revolution is when you're taking over a government either through political means or through violence. In this case, the American Revolution was actually just a rebellion. So I think that's kind of interesting. I hope he does point this out, but I thought it would just be a fun fact to share with you guys. So starting with Bacon's rebellion in Virginia, by 1760, there had been 18 uprisings aimed at overthrowing colonial governments. There has also been 6 black rebellions from South Carolina to New York, and 40 riots of various origins. By this time also, there emerged, according to Jack Green, and quote, stable, coherent, effective, and acknowledged political and social elites, end quote. And by the 1760s, this local leadership saw the possibility of directing much of their rebellious energy against England and her local officials. It was not a conscious conspiracy, but an accumulation of tactical responses. After 1763, with England victorious over France in the 7 Years' War, known as the French and Indian War, expelling them from North America, ambitious colonial leaders were no longer threatened by the French. Now, a little thing here. The reason why France got involved in what was known as the French Indian War is because with the English, going westward, the French owned territory. Not only in Quebec and parts of Canada, but also like Ohio, Indiana, all these other states, that was French territory at the time. And so when they want to help us and just colonize here and they want to move westward, who has to go? The Indians do, right? And of course, there was diplomacy and treaties beforehand before we turned to violence and said, you need to get the fuck out of here. So that's kind of how it started. So they now had only 2 rivals left, the English and the Indians. The British, wooing the Indians, had declared Indian lands beyond the Appalachians out of bounds to whites. The Proclamation of 1763. Perhaps once the British were out of the way, the Indians could be dealt with. Again, no conscious forethought, strategy by the colonial elite, but a growing awareness as events developed. With the French defeated, the British government could turn its attention to tightening control over the colonies and needed revenues to pay for the war, and looked to the colonies for that. Also, the colonial trade had become more and more important to the British economy and more profitable. It had amounted to about £500,000 in 1700, and by 1770, it was £2.8 million. So the American leadership was less in need of English rule. The English were more in need of the colonists' wealth. The elements were there for conflict. Because by this time, the colonists were making so much money off of trade, not only foreign trade, but with the Indians and the French, like they were making so much money that English got jealous because of it. And without the colonists, England would relatively just have nothing. So the war had brought glory for the generals, death to the privates, wealth for the merchants, unemployment for the poor. There were 25,000 people living in New York. There had been 7,000 in 1720 when the French and Indian War ended. A newspaper editor wrote about the growing, quote, number of beggars and wandering poor. In the streets of the city, letters in the papers questioned the distribution of wealth. Quote, how often have our streets been covered with thousands of barrels of flour for trade, while our near neighbors can hardly procure enough to make a dumpling to satisfy hunger. Gary Nash's study of city taxes list shows that by the early 1770s, the top 5% of Boston's taxpayers controlled 49% of the city's taxable assets. Ring a bell? In Philadelphia and New York, too, wealth was more and more concentrated. Court-recorded wills show that by 1750, the wealthiest people in these cities were leaving £20,000, equivalent to about $5 million today. In Boston, the lower class began to use the town meeting to vent their grievances. The governor of Massachusetts had written in these town meetings, quote, the meanest inhabitants, by their constant attendance, there generally are the more majority, and outvote the gentlemen, merchants, substantial traders, and all the better part of the inhabitants. End quote. What seems to have happened in Boston is that certain lawyers, editors, and merchants of the upper class, but excluded from the ruling circles close to England, like James Otis and Samuel Adams, organized the, quote, Boston Caucus, and through their oratory and their writing, quote, modeling labor class opinion, called the court mob into action and shaped its behavior, end quote. This is Gravy Nash's description of Otis, who he says, quote, kindly aware of the declining fortunes of the resentment of ordinary townspeople, was mirroring as well as molding popular opinion, end quote. We have here a forecast of the long history of American politics, the mobilization of low-class energy by upper-class politicians for their own purposes. It was not purely deception. It involved, in part, a genuine recognition of lower-class grievances, and which helps to account for its effectiveness as tactic over the centuries. As Nash puts it, James Otis, Samuel Adams, Royal Tyler, Oxenbridge Thatcher, and a host of other Bostonians linked to the artisans and laborers through a network of neighborhood taverns, fire companies, and the caucus, espoused a vision of politics that gave credence to laboring class views and regarded as entirely legitimate the participation of artisans and even laborers in the political process. In 1762, Otis, speaking against the conservative rulers of the Massachusetts colony, represented by Thomas Hutchinson, gave an example of the kind of rhetoric that a lawyer could use in mobilizing city merchants, mechanics, and artisans. I am forced to get my living by the labor of my hand and the sweat of my brow, as most of you are, and obliged to throw good report and evil report, for bread or bread aren't under the frowns of some who have natural divine right to be above me, and entirely owe their grandeur and honor to grinding the faces of poor. Boston seems to have been full of class anger in those days. In 1763, in the Boston Gazette, someone wrote that, quote, a few persons in power were promoting political projects for, quote, for keeping the people poor in order to make them humble, end quote. This accumulation, sense of grievance against the rich in Boston may account for the explosiveness of mob action against the Swamp Act of 1765. Through this act, the British were taxing the colonial population to pay for the French War, in which colonists had suffered to expand the British Empire. That summer, a shoemaker named Ebenezer Mackintosh led a mob in destroying the house of a rich Boston merchant named Andrew Oliver. 2 weeks later, the crowd turned to the home of Thomas Hutchinson, symbol of the rich elite who ruled the colonies in the name of England. They smashed up his house with axes, drank the wine in his wine cellar, and looted the house of his furniture and other objects. A report by colonial officials to England said that this was part of a larger scheme in which the houses of 15 rich people were to be destroyed as part of a, quote, a war of plunder, a general leveling and taking away the distinction of rich and poor, end quote. It was one of these moments in which fury against hatred against the rich went further than leaders like Otis wanted. Could class hatred be focused against the pro-British elite and deflected from the nationalist elite? In New York, that same year of the Boston house attacks, someone wrote to the New York Gazette, quote, is it equitable that 999 should suffer for the extravagance or grandeur of one, especially when it is considered that men frequently owe their wealth to the impoverished of their neighbors? The leaders of the revolution would worry about keeping such sentiments within limits. Mechanics were demanding political democracy in the colonial cities, opening meetings of representative assemblies, public gatherings, in legislative halls, and the publishing of roll call votes so that constituents could check on representatives. They wanted open-air meetings when the population could participate in making policy, more equitable taxes, price controls, and the election of mechanics and other ordinary people to government posts. Especially in Philadelphia, according to Nash, the conscience of the low middle class grew to the point where it must have caused some hard thinking, not just among the conservative loyalists sympathetic to England, but even among leaders of the Revolution. Quote, by mid-1776, laborers, artisans, and small tradesmen, employing extra-legal measures when electoral politics failed, were in clear command in Philadelphia, end quote, held by some middle-class leaders, Thomas Paine, Thomas Young, and others. They, quote, launched a full-scale attack on wealth and even on the rich to acquire unlimited private property, end quote. During elections for the 1776 convention to frame a constitution for Pennsylvania, a private committee urged voters to oppose, quote, great and overgrown rich men that would be too apt to be framing distinction in society. The private committee drew up a bill of rights for the convention, including the statement that, quote, an enormous proportion of property vested in a few individuals as dangerous to the rights and destructive of the common happiness of mankind, and therefore every free state, had the right by its laws to discourage the possession of such property, end quote. In the countryside, where most people lived, there was a similar conflict of poor against rich, one which political leaders would seek to mobilize the population against England, granting some benefits for the rebellious poor, and many more for themselves in the process. The tenant riots in New Jersey in the 1740s, the New York tenant uprisings of the 1750s and 1760s in the Hudson Valley, and the rebellion in northern New York that led to the carving of Vermont and out of New York. Now, when he mentions that in that line that New York was carved out of Vermont, what some people remember, a lot of these states were not fully drawn up yet during the colonies, even leading up to the Articles of Confederation, later on the Constitution. Some of these states were big blocks of land compared to they are now. So that's what he's talking about. States were all more than specific writing. There were long-lasting social movements, highly organized, involving the creation of counter-governments. They were aimed at a handful of rich landlords, but with the landlords far away, They often had to direct their anger against farmers who had leased the disputed land for the owners. See Edward Countryman's pioneering work on Royal Rebellion. Just as the Jersey rebels had broken in the jails to free their friends, riders in the Hudson Valley rescued prisoners from the sheriff and one time took the sheriff himself as prisoner. The tenants were seen as, quote, chiefly the dregs of the people, end quote, and the posé that the sheriff of Albany County led to Bennington in 1771 included the privileged top of the local power structure. The land riders saw their battle as poor against rich, a witness at rebel leaders' trial in New York in 1766, said that the farmers evicted by the landlords, quote, had an equitable title but not could be defended in a course of law, because they were poor, and poor men were always oppressed by the rich, end quote. Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Liberals and Vermont described themselves as, quote, a poor people fatigued in settling a wilderness country, end quote, and their opponents as a number of attorneys and other gentlemen with all their tackles of ornaments and compliments and French finesse, end quote. Land-hungry farmers in the Hudson Valley turned to the British for support against American landlords. The Green Mountain Rebels did the same, but as the conflict with the British intensified, the colonial leaders of the movement for independence, aware of the tendency of poor tenants to side with the British in their anger against the rich, adopted politics to win over people in the countryside. In North Carolina, a powerful movement of white farmers was organized against wealthy and corrupt officials in the period from 1766 to 71. Exactly those years when in the cities of the Northeast agitation was growing against the British, crowding out class issues. The movement in North Carolina was called the Regulator Movement, and it consisted, says Marvin L. Mickle, K., a specialist in history of that movement, of, quote, close conscience white farmers in the West who attempted to democratize local government in their respective countries, end quote. The regulators referred to themselves as, quote, poor industrious peasants, as, quote, laborers, as, quote, the wretched poor, quote, oppressed by, quote, rich and powerful designing monsters, end quote. The regulators saw that a combination of wealth and political power ruled North Carolina, and denounced those officials, quote, whose highest study in the promotion of their wealth, end quote. They resented the tax system, which was especially burdensome on the poor, and the combination of merchants and lawyers who worked at the courts to collect debts from the harassed farmers. In the western counties where the movement developed, only a small percentage of the households had slaves, and 41% of these were concentrated. To take one sample Western county, and less than 2% of the households, the regulators did not represent servants or slaves, but they did speak for small owners, squatters, and tenants. A contemporary account of the regulator movement in Orange County describes the situation. Lost were the people of Orange incited by the sheriff, robbed and plundered, neglected and condemned by the representatives, abused by the magistrate, obliged to pay fees regulated only by the avarice of the officer, obliged to pay a tax which they believed went to enrich and aggrandize a few, who lorded it over them continually. From all of these evils they saw no way to escape. For the men in power and the legislation were the men who were interested in what is to oppress and make gain of the laborer. In the county, in the 1760s, the regulators organized to prevent the collection of taxes or the confiscation of the property of tax delinquents. Officials said, quote, an absolute introduction of a dangerous tendency had broke out in Orange County, end quote, and made military plans to suppress it. At one point, 700 armed farmers forced the release of 2 arrested regulated leaders. The regulators petitioned the government on their grievances in 1768, citing, quote, the unequal chances the poor and the weak have in contentions with the rich and powerful, end quote. In another county, Anderson, a local militia colonel, complained of the, quote, unparalleled tumults and destructions and commotions, which at present distract this county, unquote. At one point, 100 men broke up the proceedings at a county court. But they also tried to elect farmers to the assembly, asserting that, quote, that the majority of our assembly is composed of lawyers, clerks, and others in connection with them, end quote. In 1770, there was a large-scale riot in Hillsborough, North Carolina, in which they disrupted a court, forced the judge to flee, beat 3 lawyers and 2 merchants, and looted stores. The result of this war was that the assembly passed some mild reform legislation, but also, as in, quote, act to prevent riots and tumults, end quote, and the government prepared to crush them militarily in May of 1771. there was a decisive battle in which several thousand regulars were defeated by a disciplined army using cannons. 6 regulators were hanged. Kay says that in the 3 western counties of Orange, Anson and Rowan, where the Regulator Movement was concentrated, it had the support of 6,000 to 7,000 men out of a total white taxable population of about 8,000. One consequence of this bitter conflict is that only a minority of the people in the regular counties seem to have participated as patriots in the Revolutionary War. Most of them probably remained neutral. Fortunately for the Revolutionary Movement, the key battles were being fought in the north, and here in the cities the colonial leaders were kind of middle class, who had a stake in the fight against England, who faced competition from English manufacturers. The biggest problem was to keep the populous people who were unemployed and hungry in the crisis, following the French War under control. In Boston, the economic grievances of the lowest classes mingled with anger against the British and exploded into mob violence. The leaders of the independence movement wanted to use that mob energy against England, but also contain it so that it would not demand too much of them. When riots against the Stamp Act swept Boston in 1767, they were analyzed by the commander of the British forces in North America, General Thomas Gage, as follows. The Boston mob, raised by the first instigation of many of the principal inhabitants, allured by plunder, rose shortly after their own accord, attacked, robbed, and destroyed several horses, and amongst others that of the lieutenant governor. Perhaps then began to be terrified at the spirit they had raised, to perceive that popular fury was not to be guarded, and each individual feared he might be the next victim to their rapacity. The same fear spread through the other provinces, and there has been as much pains taken since to prevent insurrections of the people as before to excite them. Gage's comment suggests that leaders of the movement against the Stamp Act had instigated crowd action, but then became frightened by the thought that it might be directed against their wealth too. At this time, the top 10% of Boston's taxpayers had about 66% of Boston's taxable wealth, while the lowest 30% of the tax-paying population had no taxable property at all. The propertyless could not vote, and so, like blacks, women, and Indians, could not participate in town meetings. These included sailors, journeymen, apprentices, and servants. Dirk Horder, a student of Boston mob actions in the Revolutionary period, calls the revolutionary leadership, quote, the Sons of Liberty, type drawn from the middle interests and well-to-do merchants, a hesitant leadership, unquote, wanting to spur action against Great Britain, yet so worrying about maintaining control over the crowds at home. It took the Stamp Act crisis to make the leadership aware of its dilemma. A political group in Boston called the Loyal Nine, merchants, distillers, shop owners, and master craftsmen who opposed the Stamp Act, organized a procession in August 1765 to protest it. They put 50 master craftsmen at the head, but needed to mobilize ship workers from the north end and the mechanics and apprentices from the south end. 2,000 or 3,000 were in the procession. Negroes were excluded. They marched to the home of the Stamp Master and burned his effigy. But after the quote gentlemen who organized the demonstrations left, the crowd went further and destroyed some of the Stamp Master's home property. Those were, as one of the Loyal Nine said, quote, amazingly inflamed people, unquote. The Loyal Nine seemed taken aback by the direct assault on the wealthy furnishings of the Stamp Master. The rich set up armed patrols. Now a town meeting was called, and the valiant leaders who had planned the demonstration denounced the violence and disavowed the actions of the crowd. As more demonstrations were planned for November 1st, 1765, when the Stamp Act was to go into effect, and for Pope's Day, November 5th, steps were taken to keep things under control. A dinner was given for certain leaders of the rioters to win them over. When the Stamp Act was repealed, due to overwhelming resistance, the conservative leaders severed their connection with the rioters. They held annual celebrations for the first anti-Stamp Act demonstrations, to which they invited, according to Horder, not the rioters, but, quote, mainly upper and middle-class Bostonians, who traveled in coaches and carriages to Roxbury or Dorchester for opulent vice, unquote. When the British Parliament turned to its next attempt to tax the colonies, this time by sale of taxes which it hoped would not excite as much opposition, the colonial leaders organized boycotts, but they stressed, quote, no mobs or tumults, let the persons and properties of your most inveterate enemies be safe, unquote. Samuel Adams advised, quote, no mobs, no confusion, no tumult. And James Otis said that, quote, no possible circumstances, though ever so oppressive, could be supposed sufficient to justify private tumults and disorders. Impressment and the courting of troops by the British were directly hurtful to the sailors and other working people. After 1768, 2,000 soldiers were quartered in Boston, and friction grew between the crowds and the soldiers. The soldiers began to take the jobs of worker people when jobs were scarce. Mechanics and shopkeepers lost work or business became caused with the colonists boycotted British goods. In 1769, employing the poor of the town, whose numbers in distress are daily increasing by the loss of its trade and commerce. On March 5th, 1770, grievances of roadmakers against British soldiers taking their jobs led to a fight. A crowd gathered in front of the custom house and began provoking the soldiers, who fired and killed first Crispus Attucks, a mulatto worker, then others. This became known as the Possum Massacre. Feelings against the British mounted quickly. There was anger at the acquittal of 6 of the British soldiers, 2 who were punished by having their thumbs braided and were discharged from the army. The account of the massacre were described by John Adams, defense attorney for the British soldiers, as, quote, a motley rabid brawl of saucy boys, Negroes and mulattoes, Irish Teagues, and outlandish Jackflowers, unquote. Perhaps 10,000 people marched in the funeral procession for the victims of the massacre out of a total Boston population of 16,000. This led England to remove the troops in Boston and try to quiet the situation. Impressment was the background of the massacre. There had been impressment riots throughout the 1760s in New York and in Newport, Rhode Island, where 500 seamen, boys, and Negroes rioted after 5 weeks of impressment by the British. 6 weeks before the Boston Massacre, there was a battle in New York of seamen against British soldiers taking their jobs, and 1 seaman was killed. In Boston, the Tea Party of December 1771, the Boston Committee of Correspondence, formed a year before to organize anti-British actions. Quote, controlled crowd action against the tea from that start, end quote. Dirk Horder says, quote, the Tea Party led to the course of acts by Parliament virtually establishing martial law in Massachusetts, dissolving the colonial government, closing the port of Boston, and sending in troops. Still town meetings and meetings rose in opposition. The seizure of a powder store by the British led 4,000 men from all around Boston to assemble in Cambridge, where some of the wealthy officials had their sumptuous homes. The crowd forced the officials to resign. The committees of correspondence to Boston and other towns welcomed this gathering but warned against destroying private property. Pauline Maier, who studied the development of opposition to Britain in the decade before 1776, and her book From Resistance to Revolution, emphasis and moderation of the leadership and, despite their desire for resistance, their, quote, emphasis on order and restraint. Quote, she notes, quote, the officers and committee members of the Sons of Liberty were drawn almost entirely from the middle and upper classes of scholarly society, unquote. At Newport, Rhode Island, for instance, the Sons of Liberty, according to a contemporary writer, quote, contained some gentlemen of the first figure and the ton of opulence, sense, and politeness, and the North Carolina, quote, one of the wealthiest of the gentlemen and freeholders, and, quote, the Sons of Liberty, similar in Virginia, South Carolina, and, quote, New York's liberties too, were involved in a small but respectably independent business ventures, and, quote, their aim, however, was to broaden the organization to develop a mass base of wage earners. Many of the Sons of Liberty groups declared as in Milford, Connecticut, their, quote, greatest abhorrence of lawlessness, or as Annapolis opposed, quote, all rights or unlawful assemblies tending to the disturbance of the public tranquility. John Adams expressed the same fears, quote, those tearings and featherings, this breaking open houses by raid, and insolent rebels, and resentment for private wrongs, or in pursuing a private prejudice and passions must be discontentments. In Virginia, it seemed clear to the educated gentry that something needed to be done to persuade the lower orders to join the revolutionary cause, to deflect their anger against England. One Virginian wrote in his diary in the spring of 1774, quote, the lower class of people here are in tumult on account of reports from Boston. Many of them expect to be pressed and compelled to go and fight the Brits. Unquote. Around the time of the Stamp Act, a Virginia orator addressed the poor, quote, are not the gentlemen made of the same materials as the lowest and poorest among them? Listen to no doctrines which may tend to divide us, but let us go hand in hand as brothers. It was a problem for which the rhetorical talents of Patrick Henry were superbly fitted. He was a Rice Isaac puts it, firmly attached to the world of the gentry, but he spoke in words that the poor whites of Virginia could understand. Henry's fellow Virginian Edmund Randolph recalled his style as, quote, simplicity and even carelessness. his pauses, which for their length might sometimes be feared to dispel the attention, riveted it the more by raising the expectations. Patrick Henry's oratory in the Virginia pointed out to relieve class tensions between upper and lower classes and form a bond against the vague enough to avoid class conflict among the rebels, and stirring enough to build public patriotic feeling for the resistance movement. Tom Paine's Common Sense, which appeared in early 1776 and became the most popular pamphlet in the American colonies, did this. It made the first bold argument for independence in words that any fairly literate person could understand. Quote, "Society and never state is blessing, but a government even in its best state is but a necessary evil." End quote. Paine disposed of the idea of the divine right of kings by a pungent history of the British monarchy, going back to the Norman conquest of 1066, when William the Conqueror came over from France to set himself on the British throne. Quote, "A French bastard landing with an armed banditti, and establishing himself King of England against the consent of the natives, is in plain terms a very paltry, rascally, unoriginal. It certainly hath no divinity in it." End quote. Paine dealt with the practical advantages of sticking to England or being separated. He knew the importance of economics. "I challenge the warmest advocate for reconciliation to show a single advantage that discontent can reap by being connected with Great Britain. I repeat the challenge, not a single advantage is derived. Our corn will fetch its price in any market in Europe, and our imported goods must be paid for by them where we will." As for the bad effects of the connection with England, Paine appealed to the colonists' memory of all the wars in which England had involved them, wars costing lives and money. "Both the injuries and disadvantages which we sustain by that connection are without numbers. Any submission to, or dependence on, Great Britain tends directly to involve this continent and Europe wars and quarrels, instead of variance with nations who would otherwise seek our friendship." He built slowly to an emotional pitch everything that is right are reasonable pleas for separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, "It's time to part." Common Sense went through 25 editions in 1776 and sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It is probable that almost every literate colonist either read it or knew about its contents. Pamphleteering had become this time the chief theater of debate about relations with England from 1750 to 1776. 400 pamphlets had appeared arguing one for one or another side of the stampede, or the Possum Massacre. Or the Tea Party, or the general questions of disobedience to law, loyalty to government rights and obligations. Paine's pamphlet appealed to a wide range of colonial opinion, angered by England, but it caused some tremors in aristocrats like John Adams, who were the patriot cause but wanted to make sure it didn't go too far in the direction of democracy. Now, fun fact, John Adams was the second president of the United States. Paine had denounced the so-called balanced government of Lords and Commons as a deception and called for single-chair representative bodies where the people could be represented. And that goes to another thing, which I'm hoping he talks about later, is you had the New Jersey Compromise and the Connecticut Compromise and the Virginia Plan. Now the two both said, look, we need to have a one state where you have a one chamber of government. Like, we have the House of Representatives and the Senate. It was supposed to be just one. But thanks to the compromises, we got two. But he wanted one. Adams denounced Paine's plan to, quote, "so democratical, without any restraint, or even attempt at any equilibrium, or counterpoise, that it must produce confusion on every evil work," end quote. Popular assemblies need to be checked, Adams thought, because they were, quote, "productive of hasty results and absurd judgments," end quote. Paine himself came out of the, quote, "lower orders of England, a staymaker, tax official, teacher, poor immigrant to England. He arrived in Philadelphia in 1774, when agitation against England was already strong in the colonies. The artisan mechanics of Philadelphia, along with journeymen apprentices and ordinary laborers, were forming into a politically conscious militia, quote, "and general damned, we thrift dirty, mutinous and disaffected, end quote. As local aristocrats described them, by speaking plainly and strongly, he could represent those politically conscious lower-class people. He opposed property qualifications for voting in Pennsylvania, but his great concern seems to have been to speak for a middle group. Quote, there is an extent of riches, as well as an extreme of poverty, which by harrying the circles of man's acquaintance, lessens his opportunities of general knowledge. End quote. Once a revolution was under way, Paine more and more made it clear that he was not for the crowd action of lower-class people like those militia who in 1779 attacked the house of James Wilson. Wilson was a revolutionary leader who opposed price controls and wanted a more conservative government than was given by the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776. Paine became an associate of one of the wealthiest men in Pennsylvania, Robert Morris, and a supporter of Morris's creation, the Bank of North America. Later, during the controversy over adopting the Constitution, Paine would once again represent urban artisans who favored a strong central government. He seemed to believe that such a government could represent some great common interest. In this sense, he lent himself perfectly to the myth of the Revolution. This was on behalf of the united people. The Declaration of Independence brought that myth to its peak of eloquence, each harsher measure of British control. The Proclamation of 1763, not allowing colonists to settle beyond the Appalachians. The Stamp Act, the Stamp Tax, the Townshend Acts, including the one on tea, the stationing of troops in the Possum Massacre, the closing of the port of Boston, and the dissolution of the Massachusetts legislature, escalated colonial rebellion to the point of revolution. The colonists had responded with the Stamp Act Congress, the Sons of Liberty, the Committees of Correspondence, the Boston Tea Party, and finally in 1774, the setting up of a Continental Congress, the first official Congress prior to a constitution. An illegal body, forerunner of a future independent government, it was after the military clash at Lexington, Concord in April 1775 between colonial Minutemen and British troops that the Continental Congress decided on separation. They organized a small committee to draw up the Declaration of Independence, with Thomas Jefferson wrote it. It was adopted by the Congress on January 12th and officially proclaimed on July 4th, 1776. Now, fun fact, some people don't actually know this, that the Constitution was written in June. It was signed July 2nd, but they called it the Proclamation July 4th. Now, actually, some founding fathers went back and actually said, I don't understand why people are selling July 4th when it was actually signed July 2nd. So that's what people need to remember. By this time, there was already a powerful sentiment for independence. Resolutions adopted in North Carolina in May of 1776 and sent to the Continental Congress declared independence of England, asserted that all British laws was null and void, and urged military preparations. About the same time, the town of Malden, Massachusetts, responding to a request of the Massachusetts House of Representatives that all towns in the state declare their views on independence. Quote, we therefore renounce with disdain our connection with the kingdom of slaves. We bid a farewell. We bid a final adieu to Britain. End quote. Quote, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds, they should declare the causes. This was the opening of the Declaration of Independence. Then in that second paragraph came the powerful philosophical statement. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, depriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and institute a new government. It then went on to list grievances against the king, quote, a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. End quote. The list accused the king of dissolving colonial governments, controlling judges, sending swarms of officers to harass our people, sending in armies of occupation, cutting off colonial trade with other parts of the world, taxing the colonists without their consent, and waging war against them, quote, transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny. All of this, the language of popular control over governments, the right of rebellion and revolution, indignation as political tyranny, economic burdens and military attacks, was language well suited to unite large numbers of colonists and persuade even those who had grievances against one another to turn against England. Some Americans were clearly omitted from the circle of united interest drawn by the Declaration of Independence. Indians, black slaves, women indeed, One paragraph of the Declaration charged the king with inciting slave rebellions and Indian attacks. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our foreign geos the merciless Indian savages, whose known rules of warfare is undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. 20 years before the Declaration, a proclamation of the legislature of Massachusetts of November 3, 1755, declared the Penobscot Indians, quote, rebels, Indians, and traitors, and provided a bounty for, quote, every scalp of a male Indian brought in, 40 pounds, and for every scalp of any family Indian or male Indian under the age of 20 years that shall be killed, 20 pounds. Thomas Jefferson had written a paragraph of the Declaration accusing the king of transporting slaves from Africa to the colonies and, quote, suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain these execrable comments, end quote. This seemed to express moral indignation against slavery and the slave trade. Jefferson's personal distaste for slavery must be put alongside the fact that he owned hundreds of slaves to the day he died. Now, fun fact, George Washington was the only founding father out of all those who became president that freed the slaves when he died. Fun fact. Behind it was the growing fear among Virginians and some other Southerners about the growing number of black slaves in the colonies, 20% of the total population, and the threat of slave revolts as the number of slaves increased. Jefferson's paragraphs were removed by the Continental Congress because slaveholders themselves disagreed about the desirability of ending the slave trade. So even the gesture toward the black slave was omitted in the Great Manifesto of Freedom of the American Revolution. Now, what he's saying by that is, the Founding Fathers, well, Thomas Jefferson especially, wanted to put the ending of slavery not in the Declaration, but in the Constitution, and they didn't because of that reason. That was just mentioned. The use of the phrase, quote, all men are created equal, end quote, was probably not a deliberate attempt to make a statement about women. It was just that women were beyond consideration as worthy of inclusion. They were politically invisible. Through practical needs gave a woman a certain authority in the home, on the farm, or in occupations like midwifery. They were simply overlooked in any consideration of political rights by motions of civic equality. To say that the Declaration of Independence, even by its own language, was limited to life, liberty, and happiness for white males is not to denounce the makers and signers of the Declaration for holding the ideas expected of privileged males of the 18th century. Reformers and radicals, looking discontentedly at history, are often accused of expecting too much from a past political epoch, and how sometimes they do. Oh. But the point of noting those outside the arc of human rights in the Declaration is not, centuries late and pointlessly to lay impossible moral burdens on that time. It is to try to understand the way in which the Declaration functioned to mobilize certain groups of Americans, ignoring others. Surely inspirational language to create a secure consensus is still used in our time to cover up serious conflicts of interest in that consensus, and to cover up also the omission of large parts of the human race. The philosophy of the Declaration that government is set up by the people to secure their life, liberty, and happiness, and is set to be overthrown when it no longer does that, is often traced to the ideas of John Locke and the Second Treatise of Government that was published in England in 1689. When the English were rebelling against tyrannical kings and setting up parliamentary government, the Declaration, like Locke's Second Treatise, talked about government and political rights, but ignored the existing inequalities in property. And how could people truly have equal rights with stark differences in wealth? What we call wealth inequality. Locke himself was a wealthy man with investments in silk trade and slave trade, income from loans and mortgages. He invested heavily in the first issue of the stock of the Bank of England, just a few years after he had written the Second Treatise as a classic statement of liberal democracy. As advisor to the Carolinas, he had suggested a government of slave owners run by wealthy land barons. Locke's statement of people's government was in support of revolution and England for the free development of mercantile capitalism at home and abroad. Locke himself regretted that the labor of poor children, quote, is generally lost to the public till they are 12 or 14 years old, quote, and suggested all children over 3 of families really should attend, quote, working schools, so they would be, quote, from infancy and know to walk, end quote. The English Revolutions of the 17th century brought representative government and opened up discussions of democracy. But as the English historian Christopher Hill wrote in The Puritan Revolution, quote, the establishment of a parliamentary supremacy, or the rule of law, no doubt mainly benefited the men of property. End quote. The kind of arbitrary taxation that threatened the security of property was overthrown. Monopolies were ended to give more free rein to business, and sea power began to be used for an imperial policy abroad, including the conquest of Ireland. The Levellers and the Diggers, two political movements which wanted to carry equality into the economic sphere, were put down by the Revolution. One can see the reality of Locke's nice phrases about representative government and the class divisions and conflicts in England that followed the Revolution that Locke supported. At the very time the American scene was becoming tense in 1768, England was wrecked by riots and strikes of cook-heavers, sawmill workers, hatters, weavers, sailors, because of the high price of bread and the miserable wages. The Annual Register reviewed the events of the spring and summer of 1768. A general dissatisfaction unhappily prevailed among several of the lowest of the order of peoples. This ill temper, which was partly occasioned by the high price of provisions, and partly proceeded from other causes, too frequently manifested itself in acts of tumult and riots, which were productive of the most melancholy consequences. Quote, the people, who were supposed at the heart of Locke's theory of people's sovereignty, were defined by a British member of Parliament. Quote, I don't mean the mob, I mean the middling of people of England, the manufacturer, the yeoman, the merchant, the country's gentleman. In America, too, the reality behind the words of the Declaration of Independence, issued in the same year as Adam Smith's Capitalist Manifesto, quote, the wealth of nations, was that a rising class of important people needed to enlist on their side enough the Americans to defeat England, without disturbing too much the relations of wealth and power that developed over 150 years of colonial history. Indeed, 69% of the signers of the Declaration of Independence had held colonial office under England. George Washington was one of them. When the Declaration of Independence was read, with all its flaming radical language, from the town hall balcony in Boston, it was read by Thomas Crafts, a member of the Royal Nine group, conservatives who had opposed militant actions against the British. 4 days after the reading, the Boston Committee of Correspondence ordered the townsmen to show up on the common for a military draft. The rich, it turned out, could avoid the draft by paying for substitutes. The poor had to serve. See you trying today? I see. This led to rioting and shouting, quote, tyranny is tyranny, let it come from whom it may, end quote. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed and learned some things. I did learn a few things myself about, the lead up to the American Revolutionary War. Schools only teach so much, and it's great to dig into a fantastic book of history and being able to get a new perspective on what happened, and maybe it might change your mind. Maybe it'll, give you some more to talk about the next time you have a conversation about this stuff. You're like, hey, I learned some stuff from this book, And that's what my job is here, is to help educate people, helping them relax to some quiet reading content. Other than that, I hope you guys have a great night, and I'll see you next time.